I look so weird without beard. All right. So should we start? All right. Yeah. Okay. Hello. This is the My Artifact episode number 4179. Today's date is July 28th, 2026. It's been almost like a morning at 8:18 a.m. All right. It's a very beautiful morning, by the way. Yeah. There is no sunlight that much. It's really beautiful. All right, so let's just start. All right, yeah. So question is that is audio enough? Yeah, that's a really good question. All right, first of all, what exactly is this question, and why am I asking this question to myself? I wanted to build such a AI that could predict the future. Why? Because of that, if I could able to be build such a AI that could predict the future, it could shape the humanity in much more better way. The 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 biggest kind of like something uh, the biggest kind of like something the restriction or kind of like a bottleneck that we have for growth is that we don't know our mistake. Okay, when we try to execute any kind of like a plan or any kind of like execution, that execution is a kind of like a failed because of lot of factor. Okay, so if I could kind of like build such a product or such a AI that could kind of like find the mistake before it's even execute, then we would have a kind of like a very less mistake, and we would have a kind of like a something very immense growth in very short amount of time. Okay, for the humanity, I'm not saying that kind of like for me, for the rest of the world, things and that and that. Okay, um, I know it's a kind of like a very long idea, but this is what I was kind of like thinking. That another thing is that will I be able to make it, like is this kind of like a very futuristic concept, and kind of like will I be able to make such a AI that could predict the future? The answer is yeah, we are arrive at that point that we could able to be create such a product that could kind of like something predict the possible future, and that is a real, by the way. It's not really that it's not really possible, it is a possible, it's a very genuine thing. Okay, um okay. Why is this kind of a question? Okay, so basically is this thing, why am I asking this question to myself? Before I wanted to build such a product that could kind of like predict the future, I wanted to aware of all the possible consequences. Obviously is this thing that every action comes with the consequences, so I have to be aware of that. So I went. So I went to ChatGPT. I said that I wanted to build such a AI that could predict the future. Suggest me hundreds of question. I wanted to aware of all the possible consequences. So suggest me hundreds of question. Uh, Sorry about the disturbance. All right. Okay, so let's talk about something. This is the part two, by the way. The part one is kind of get disturbed by uh, external factor. We will not going to talk about that. Let's talk about something. The question is that is audio is actually enough? What is actually audio? So basically, is this thing the Adam is a AI that could predict the future. Okay, and Adam can able to be predict the future regarding about the data that it has. Okay, and what is actually that data? That data is a artifact. Okay, what is actually artifact? Artifact is a kind of like a simply platform where people who kind of like record their thoughts and things and that and that. It's a kind of like a diary. Okay, people kind of like wrote the diary every single day. Instead of writing a diary, they are kind of like a recording their diary. I called it audio artifact. I called it artifact. So basically, the when the people who kind of like record their thoughts and things and that, I would realize that their behavioral pattern, like how does people interact, how does people, what is actually their thoughts and things. Like usually is this thing that because of their thinking, I would kind of like simply create the copy of that behavioral pattern. Obviously, I don't really have the kind of like a detail about that particular person, who is that particular person, nothing really at all. But I do know that their behavioral pattern, like how they will interact with the world and things and that and that and that. So if I have that information, I would kind of like extract that information, their behavioral pattern, and create a kind of like a digital copy in the art in Adam. Because of Adam can kind of like have like imagine of one particular person have a kind of like a copy of behavior pattern. So imagine as a kind of like a millions or billions of people, Adam have that information because millions and billions of people who kind of like record the artifact. So let's just imagine that almost like a millions or billions of people have a kind of like a some data of behavioral pattern. So it act as a kind of like a simply digital copy or digital world or digital people. It's not exact copy, but it's a kind of like a from behavioral pattern. I would able to be kind of like a simulate the scenario regarding about if I execute the task, what is actually their behavior would be. Example, the particular person who doesn't like sweet, 10 out of maybe 8 people don't like sweet. In other group, 10 out of maybe 9 people like sweet. So if I knew that particular pattern, if I knew that majority of the people like sweet and majority of people don't really like the sweet, highly I would kind of like a chances that I would kind of like a recommend whatever the kind of like a sweet product, I would kind of like a recommend to the group B, because group B has a kind of like a higher chances to people will gonna buy that particular product or things like that and that. Okay, so this is called kind of like a behavioral pattern. Like I am kind of like a somebody creating kind of like a behavioral copy of that particular person and try to execute the scenario. Okay, it's not really that I'm kind of like a selling the product, no, but it's a kind of like that key. I would have that information. From that information I would kind of like a simulate the scenario. What's a simulate the scenario? Simulate the scenario means like that ki when any kind of like a somebody, let's just say kind of like a somebody one particular person who wanted to build a kind of like a somebody building which is kind of like a far much more bigger than Burj Khalifa or things like that and that. So in that situation, whatever the kind of like architecture, whatever the design that it has, it kind of like execute that design in Adam. Adam not only have information regarding about the people behavioral pattern, Adam do have information regarding about the kind of like nature and kind of like the things and that and that. Okay, how that particular information Adam has it. Basically is this thing, I would not gonna take the information from the kind of like just artifact. I would gonna take the information from internet, from Meta, from kind of like assembly the internet. Yeah, like basically people kind of like buy the data from the internet. Okay, like basically ChatGPT does. So many kind of like a platform are actually available so that we could supposed to buy that such a data. Okay, obviously some sort of data we cannot able to be buy, like classified information and things like that we cannot able to be buy or we cannot able to be access such data. But a kind of like a usual public internet data we could able to be buy. Okay, so I would have that information and I would kind of like simulate the scenario. But how the kind of like actually how that thing will gonna happen, like basically behavioral pattern is actually come from the artifact, fine. But what about the nature? Okay, like basically wind, or maybe kind of like a sound, or maybe kind of like the natural element, where that kind of like somebody that behavioral pattern of that wind, how that actually come from? Well, that actually came from probability, because entire universe is kind of like a depend on probability. That key, uh, what why the thing actually happened, why the kind of like a rain happened, why the snow happened, why the desert are kind of like have so much sunlight and things and that. These are how a kind of like a something, every action are kind of like in the probability. Okay, because in the probability the Sahara desert is a kind of like a, one of the warmest or one of the kind of like hottest temperature on the planet earth, is not because of it's a desert, is because of that their geography is a kind of like a situated at the equator, which has a kind of like a higher sunlight. So it has a kind of like a higher kind of like a hot temperature over here, over there. So yeah, like this is kind of like a probability, like basically this is thing, the every kind of like a scenario actually happened is based on probability. Okay, like a human interaction, the people, the nature, the universe, the celestial object, everything is actually kind of like happened through probability, as probability. So probability architecture is also kind of like a somebody execute to kind of like a simulate the kind of like a natural stuff, like a wind, or kind of like a somebody rain, or summer, or snow, or things and that. Okay, so I have kind of like a data of people. Okay, and I have kind of like a simply data of nature. Okay, that data of people is a behavioral pattern, and the kind of like a nature is a kind of like a probability aspect ratio. By the way, probability is not only kind of like a work with the nature, it also work with the human perspective too. So basically this thing, the core architecture is a probability architecture. I do have information regarding about the weather patterns and kind of like things and that from the kind of like internet, from the kind of like a weather apps and things and that. So I do have that information, and from that information I will kind of like simulate the scenario. Not only simulate the scenario, the nature sequence, but as well as kind of like simply the human behavioral pattern. Okay, now that simulation is a kind of like a come from very different thing. I will not gonna kind of like do the simulation, like I will gonna do the simulation, but the prompt is a kind of like a put by the people. Okay, organization, or kind of like a somebody, the government, or things and that. If any kind of like a government wanted to kind of like execute any kind of like a policy, one of the biggest bottleneck is that they don't know will they kind of like execute the kind of like assembly the execute any kind of like assembly task, or execute any kind of like a plan, will it be kind of like implement or not, what kind of like a factor will gonna happen. They don't know exactly about that particular stuff. Adam will kind of like give them heads up information that what might gonna problem that we might gonna face if we try to execute that particular idea or things and that. So Adam is a try to kind of like simulate that scenario, every scenario, human people simulation and things and that. Now the question was that is audio is actually enough? Like basically, as I mentioned, the artifact is audio, and most of the kind of like some information actually came from the artifact. Okay, but audio is actually enough? Well, no, audio is not enough. As I mentioned, I have to be scrape the internet, I have to be kind of like access the internet and things and that. But the audio is not enough. Okay, the possibility of finding the future, it really required kind of like so much amount of data. Okay, and like basically there are two kind of like a data. Okay, first of all is that ki public internet data. Okay, that I could get, everyone can get. Okay, I just need to buy and that, so it's not like that kind of like a things. Okay, this is a public data. Okay, another data is a kind of like a human interface data. Okay, and human interface data means like that key, like a human psychology, like basically when you scroll through YouTube, what kind of like a video that you might gonna watch regarding about the thumbnail, title and things and that. Okay, human interaction data, and the human interaction data Google has it more. Okay, because Google is a kind of like accessing the Android and things and that. So Google has a more information regarding about how does human interact, where they click, what kind of like a thumbnail they like, what kind of like a video that they watch, what kind of like a song they wanted to play, what is actually stuff that they search on Google and things and that. So human interaction is a kind of like a very massive data. That is a very essential data, by the way, human interaction data. And human thought process are actually came from the artifact. So basically for the Adam, if the Adam wanted to simulate the scenario, human thought process actually came from the artifact, so that is not going to worry about that because this is only my platform too. The human interaction information like a Google, this is a kind of like a, one of the biggest thing that I don't really have it. And if I have it, then the simulation might gonna get kind of like a much more stronger, much more kind of like a, yeah, rigid, much more kind of like a something higher probability chances that it would kind of like a simulate the scenario much more better way, or much more like a much more kind of like a higher probability chances. Okay, but the human simulations or human interaction information, I don't really have it. Google has it. Then why don't you kind of like take that information from the Google? Well, I can't. Oh yeah, Google does not sell that information. So yeah, so is audio is actually enough? Well, basically it's this thing that I need like basically if I wanted to kind of like execute the simulation, I need at least like a billions of artifact. Okay, at least like a billions of artifact, and that billions of artifact I will gonna get maybe after a 10 year of artifact. Like after the 10 year, like if I launch the artifact today, after the 10 year I might gonna have almost like a billions of artifact probably. And if I have that billions of artifact, then simulation might gonna happen for like as much as better, but still it's not enough. Okay, yeah, having more and more artifact, having more and more information, simulation might gonna get much more stronger, much more rigid, much more kind of like a higher possible chances regarding about confidence and probability. But yeah, now basically is this thing you mentioned that ki human behavioral, sorry, human interaction pattern. Okay, human interaction information that actually came from the Google. So why don't you collaborate with the Google? Well, it's not, well, basically there are so many factors are responsible for me to kind of like collaborate with the Google and kind of like execute the Adam with the Google. Why? Tell me why. One of the biggest thing is that Google has it is a quantum chip. They have Willow chip. It's a quantum chip, and for the simulation process, sorry about these noises. It's very bothering me. But this is kind of like a something like the kind of like an issue regarding our artifact. You cannot stop other people, but still. All right, yeah. So basically, is this thing there are much more kind of like advantage that I get if I kind of like collaborate with the Google. The first thing is that Google quantum chip, and for the Adam simulate the scenario, I need a quantum chip, and there's a lot of noises over here. Welcome to India, by the way. People don't really care about the privacy over here. People just kind of like barge in their horns and things and loud noise and things and that. But still, we are in India and we cannot change anything at all. So yeah. All right. So what was I kind of like saying? The collaboration with the Google is a kind of like a much more advantage for me, because if I collaborate, I would not gonna get just a chip. I would get the kind of like information, the human behavioral information. Okay, and the chip is a kind of like a very much essential. Okay, because if I have the quantum chip, obviously the where that simulation actually happened, that simulation actually happened in that quantum chip. Classical computer cannot able to handle that simulation. Now in today's time, we have a kind of like a two company who kind of like a somebody build quantum chip. First is the Google Willow chip, and another is the IBM. They also have a kind of like a quantum computer. Now basically is this thing that why not you don't want to collaborate with the Google? What is actually the reason? The reason is that if I collaborate, if the Adam would kind of like somebody collaborate with the kind of like a Google, then Adam would kind of like share the information. Google will not gonna agree the kind of like a collaboration if I'm kind of like a Google is kind of like sharing the information with Adam. Google wants something, and what is that something? The artifact. Okay, Google wants artifact information. Adam wants kind of like a Google information. They both are kind of like a get profitable, but if the Google has the information of Adam or artifact, then in that scenario Google will kind of like a dominate. Why? Because Google is a ad company. Yeah, literally ad company. They are kind of like selling advertisement. Okay, most of the revenue actually come from the advertisement. If they knew that every person what they think, what is actually their behavioral pattern and things and that, so Adam is a sorry Google will kind of like sell their product. Okay, they kind of like a deep target the kind of like the people and kind of like selling the product to the people who are really vulnerable and things and that. And as also is this thing, Google is a kind of like a much more advanced. Google have a kind of like a own AI company called DeepMind, and Google has a kind of like a so much far ahead regarding about the technology, regarding about what they kind of like execute any kind of like stuff. It is a massive kind of like a growth and things and that. So if I'm kind of like thinking from that point of perspective, having the artifact information to Google, it's not really good thing. So basically is this thing that yeah. But dude, like I'm gonna ask this question that if the Google you are kind of like really scared of every single time I try to do something like someone kind of like bothering me, like my mother, then God, then this stuff. हो आप खा लो. Okay, so what was I kind of like saying? I was kind of like saying that yeah, yes, I cannot able to be collaborate. Yeah, like okay, question was that yeah, if if you are kind of like if I'm really scared to kind of like share the information with the Google regarding about that they would kind of like somebody they would kind of utilize this thing for kind of like selling the product and things and that, right? So you also have the information then, and you also kind of like somebody earning money through advertisement. So why not I should supposed to be scared with myself? Okay, yeah, like if the kind of like a Google does it, I'm kind of like really scared, but if I does it, then I'm not really scared. Like why? Okay, like are you kind of like a noble or what? No, not really at all. Actually the Google has a kind of like a much more advantage. Let me tell you one thing that Google has a kind of like a much more visual area to kind of like promote their product. Google homepage, Chrome, Android, um, Google products, YouTube, Google photos, so many things. Like Google have kind of like an entire kind of like somebody the ecosystem regarding about they would kind of like somebody sell the product. Oh hello, this is the part 4. Oh my god. Okay, yeah, so basically is this thing, am I kind of like scared of kind of like somebody the like yeah, like Google has a kind of like a much more advantage regarding about the sharing the product and things and that they have kind of like an entire ecosystem, and they could kind of like sell the product in multiple ways and multiple possible ways and things and that. I even if I have the people information, I might not able to be sell that much in amount of product because I am not kind of like a building like I don't really have that much ecosystem. I do have artifact, and artifact, yeah, obviously I'm kind of like somebody the running the advertisement to kind of like somebody the to kind of like somebody break even and things and that. But still is this thing that even if I have the advantage of people information, I might not gonna use that information to kind of like sell the product because I don't really have ecosystem. Okay, Google has it, and if the Google have the information regarding about the artifact, they might gonna sell the product. They will kind of like they would find the kind of like a vulnerability regarding about the people, what they think, and that and that and that. And from that possible perspective, they might gonna utilize this information for not wrong purposes, but it's not really right. Okay, yeah. Like basically is this thing that key, yeah. But dude, you kind of like mentioned that you will kind of like extract the kind of like a people information for the Adam. So what's like a basically like a, if the Google does it wrong, if you does it right, what exactly is this thing? Well, basically is this thing Adam is a kind of like a simulation process. Okay, yeah. Well, Adam is not kind of like a sharing the information. Adam does have information. Like okay, let me tell you something like that. Imagine as a kind of like a something chat gpt. Okay, so you put the prompt like basically write me a kind of like a something email for 2 days of holidays for my manager. So basically it's this thing that key chat gpt kind of like a scan through millions of emails and things other than it kind of like a wrote the kind of like a email for you. So basically what exactly happened that ChatGPT is not kind of like sharing the information through millions of things and that. ChatGPT kind of like giving me the final product. Adam does the same thing too. Adam does have information regarding about the artifact, but when the other people will kind of like put the prompt or kind of like simulate the scenario, they would not gonna kind of like get the entire kind of like artifact information, nothing really at all. They kind of like get the final result regarding about the kind of like what is actually their prompt and what might gonna answer would be look like or what kind of like some result or simulation would gonna look like. Okay, that is a kind of like a final product. They will not gonna get the entire information. All right. So basically, is this thing that key, yeah, I am kind of like a taking the user information for simulate the scenario, but for it is a kind of like a something good purposes. It was kind of like a something is this thing for the adding value and things and that. Okay, like basically good purposes is not really that. Obviously, people will kind of like utilize the Adam for wrong purposes too. I am making sure that wrong purposes should supposed to be happen less and good purposes happen should supposed to be happen more. I'm gonna make sure that, but still I'm not kind of giving the guarantee that Adam will not gonna utilize for wrong purposes. People are kind of like a very different. People are kind of like basically is this thing that a criminal mindset or kind of like a wrong thing. We cannot able to define what is really right and wrong thing. Okay, yeah, like that is a kind of like stuff. But that is a kind of like a whole another things. Okay, yeah, like let's make the product first, fix them later. That is a kind of like a somebody that mentality that we have. And like yeah, that is a kind of like a thing. So if you are kind of like a worry about that key, like this might gonna happen, this might gonna happen, this might gonna happen, then we would not gonna kind of like simply develop the product as much as better way possible. So yeah, so question is that is audio is actually enough? I need at least like a 1 billion artifact. If I have 1 billion of artifact, then audio is actually enough. But still audio is not enough. I need the information. The interactive information of about humans, about the Google, I would not gonna get that information, but I would kind of like simply the something to get the information through internet scraping and things like that and that. Okay, what about the quantum chip? Okay, so quantum chip is a kind of like a product. Okay, and I could buy the quantum chip. It's not really that key. Like I have to be kind of like a make a deal and kind of like somebody sharing my information. No, I could buy the kind of like a quantum chip. But also is this thing na ki I don't want to rely on Google. I have to be make my quantum chip. Okay, yeah. Instead of kind of like a build, and if I wanted to make my quantum chip, that the Google will not gonna share the technology transfer. What's a technology transfer? A technology transfer means like that ki how does Google makes a quantum chip? They have a kind of like entire blueprint, and they will not gonna share that information. That how do we supposed to make that kind of like a quantum chip? Okay, so basically it's this thing that ki I would have to be kind of like a create my own quantum chip, or maybe kind of like a IBM might gonna help, because IBM might gonna kind of like agree with the kind of like a technology transfer. If the IBM is a kind of like agree with the technology transfer, then I would kind of like make my own quantum chip. Also, I'm not gonna rely on something else. But still, at the beginning phases, I would have to be buy the quantum chip and kind of like a buy the technology transfer from the. Alright, I have to end here. This is it, and thank you.